We will have two speakers. The first speaker is Stefanie Schüler-Springorum. The second speaker is Dorothee Wierling. Stefanie Schüler-Springorum will deal with reconciliation after 1945, or let's say with discussions after 1945, and Dorothee Wierling after 1989. Stefanie Schüler-Springorum is heading the research institute about antisemitism at the Technical University of Berlin. She has written a book about the Jewish minority in Königsberg between 1871 and 1945. That was her dissertation, and she wrote a second book about the Spanish Civil War, which is interesting in our context, of course, too. And Dorothee Wierling is professor for contemporary history in Hamburg, and she's the co-director of the Zeitgeschichtliche Forschungsstelle, that is an institute for contemporary history in Hamburg. She published a book about the generation of 49, that is a collective biography of people living in the GDR who were born in 1949. And that was her second dissertation, and the first dissertation just reminded to me. Domestic maids in Germany. Topic not related to our conference, but anyway. So we are looking forward to the two papers, and the first paper will be given by Stefanie.
Yes, just a second. I will need some water because my voice is not perfect, so I hope it will last. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's my first time here in Ukraine, and I'm very excited and very glad for this invitation, for the nice evening yesterday, and I'm looking forward to all the discussions in the conference. As Martin Schulze Wessel said, I will deal with Germany and the Nazi past, and I will start with a quote from one of my favorite academic ideals, Hannah Arendt. In 1950, the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt visited her home country 17 years after she had been forced into exile, barely survived a detention camp in the south of France, and finally made it to the United States. The bottom line of her experience, 5 years after the war had ended, reads as follows, and now I quote Hannah Arendt. "Nowhere is this nightmare of destruction and horror less felt and less talked about than in Germany itself. A lack of response is evident everywhere, and it is difficult to say whether this signifies a half-conscious refusal to yield to grief or a genuine inability to feel. Amid the ruins, Germans mail each other picture postcards still showing the cathedrals and marketplaces, the public buildings and bridges that no longer exist. And the indifference with which they walk through the rubble has its exact counterpart in the absence of mourning for the dead, or in the apathy with which they react, or rather fail to react, to the fate of the refugees in their midst. This general lack of emotion, at any rate, this apparent heartlessness, sometimes covered over with cheap sentimentality, is only the most conspicuous outward symptom of a deep-rooted, stubborn, and at times vicious refusal to face and come to terms with what really happened." End of quote. The indifference Hannah Arendt is describing here so impressively led to two basic reactions among the German population when directly confronted with German war crimes right after the war. First, they were counted up against German suffering, that is like, yes, but we suffered the bombings, yes, but we suffered the expulsions from the Eastern territories, we lost territories, all the rapes in Berlin, and so on and so on. That was one way of reacting. And second, if this first way didn't convince, the call was made for wiping the slate clean to finally draw a Schlussstrich, like a final stroke, as we say in Germany, to not talk about the past anymore, but to concentrate on the present and the future. Interestingly enough, both reactions can be found in abundance right after the war had ended. Even in the 46-47, they talked about the Schlussstrich. And of course, to no surprise, we can still find them today. In the meantime, however, today, Germany has changed markedly in this respect. Or to put it differently, we are world champions not only in football, but in the eyes of many also in coming to terms with the one's past. Our memorial sites serve as models for others, as do our educational programs and at least some of our historiographical work. And our politicians never forget to mention this new national feature when negotiating the European integration process. In the following talk, I would like to point out to two things with regards to this championship. One rather banal, and the other, in my eyes, crucial. First of all, and this is a banal one, or maybe not so, it is important to note that it took some decades to come to the present situation. Decades in which the victims were for many years silenced, left alone, and not compensated, nor materially nor morally, while the great majority of the perpetrators were able to live out their lives unmolested. A German journalist and writer, Ralph Giordano, has once aptly called this the second German guilt. And I think it is important that we do not forget it, all later achievements notwithstanding. And second, it is in my eyes just as important to remember the basic condition of this German way of coming to terms with the past, which is a lost war, an unconditional surrender, and an occupation government that forced the Germans to confront its recent past as a crime. And this is in big letters in my paper here. As jurisdically difficult and socially insufficient the Nuremberg war crime trials and the process of denazification might have been, they established a line that no one could go beyond anymore in the coming years without leaving the common democratic ground. And this line reads as follows: National Socialism was not a political option among others, but a criminal regime, and discrimination against and hatred against minorities such as Jews or Roma or others was not an opinion, but a crime. And last but not least, fascist violence and genocide was not something that could be legitimated in certain cases, like things that happen in war, but murder. Thus, the Allies, right after the end of the Nazi regime, very clearly established once and for all what was morally right and what was wrong. And this, I'm convinced, has been maybe their most important heritage, the meaning of which will become even more clear when we discuss in the next session, we discuss Spain and the Franco regime. As we all know, after the founding of the two Germanys, and I will talk now only about West Germany and then the United Germany, leaving the GDR to my colleague Dorothee Wierling, after the founding of the two Germanys, the great majority of the impending lawsuits against Nazi perpetrators were shut down. Many of those who had been sentenced to long-term imprisonments came free, while others were never molested. If in any case, later on, Nazi crimes would be persecuted in the coming decades, they concentrated mostly on the, like, say, murderers on the ground, the perpetrators, low-range perpetrators, that is the camp guards or SS-men, who could easily be targeted as non-educated followers, or, that was even more common, as sadistical exceptions from the rule, while the normal Germans just followed orders and had no other way than to obey. The historians today in Germany, or not only in Germany, talk about a continuity of the elites in Western Germany, which means that after the top people had been tried in Nuremberg, more or less the same men and very few women that had served during the Nazi regime were still in their positions in the state. The state administration, the ministries, the army, the universities, the police, the law system, and the same goes for many medical doctors in important positions, for certain journalists, and in general for the free market. Or to put it differently, the German society, the West German society of the 50s and 60s was a post-fascist society. So the question remains, how could it have been different? or what to do with a population that to a great extent had supported the criminal regime and that of course did not change overnight. As you can imagine, these questions have been bitterly debated over and over again in Germany, and we heard something this morning, and we will, I think, continue to debate exactly these questions here at this conference. What is important to note, though, is that the long process of coming to terms has been pushed forward in the first, say, 30 years after the war, especially by juridical persecution, by some famous great trials on a national and some less famous on a local level, which I'm repeating myself, was made possible in the first place by the Allies and the establishment of right and wrong. After a decade, like in the 50s, of releasing people rather than putting them to jail, it was a local, at the beginning, a tiny local trial in the city of Ulm against the SS Einsatzgruppen, the SS Special Task Forces, who massacred hundreds of thousands of Jews in the East, that triggered off a new round of investigation. And given the very complicated federalism of the German law system, it was thanks to the founding of a central clearing institution in the context of the Ulm trial in 1959 that those endeavors had a better chance of ending in persecution. But still, given the fact that in the police and in the justice institution, ex-Nazis were still abundant, it always depended on the persistence and the engagement of certain individuals in order to push through such an investigation. The most important person in that regard was the general state persecutor of the federal state of Hessen, Fritz Bauer, who, as a social democrat and a Jew, had been imprisoned himself shortly in 1933 and then fled to Scandinavia. In 1962, he managed to bring to trial a group of men who had served in the Auschwitz concentration camp, thus presenting what today we call the Holocaust to a broad German public, a milestone in the history of the German coming to terms with the past. It should be noted, though, that for the preparation of this trial, Bauer relied on a younger generation of persecutors because he was only too aware of the fact that in his own department, let alone the police, he was surrounded by enemies, that is, by ex-Nazis who did everything they could to sabotage these kind of trials. And it is not by chance in this context that only some years before, Bauer had passed his knowledge about the whereabouts of Adolf Eichmann to the Israeli state, because he was afraid that a German court would not condemn him or that the Nazi networks within the police would sabotage his arrest in the first place. His story, his engagement in the Auschwitz and in the Eichmann trial have recently been subject to two marvelous movies, which I recommend to everyone here. If there's anyone from the Goethe Institute, maybe it's a good idea to bring these movies to the Ukraine. And I recommend them especially because of the way they capture the atmosphere in West Germany in the late 50s and early 60s as a post-fascist society. On the other hand, it's important to note these years were not only marked by silence, not in the families, where talk about one's own suffering in the war, the family suffering was abundant, and not and markedly in the cultural sphere, where the recent Nazi time and its aftermath was a subject of many important movies. For example, Wolfgang Staudte, whose most famous movie is called, with the telling title, The Murders Are Living Among Us, and many others, and important theater plays who also pushed the discussion forward, like Rolf Hochhuth's play on the Stellvertreter in English? The Deputy, or Peter Weiss, Die Ermittlung, the Investigation. These are 1963, 1965. So in general, one could say that it was the juridical persecution and the cultural sphere that in the first decades after the war engaged in a debate about the past, while the academia and the political system in general rather lagged behind, last but not least because of their own involvement in the old regime. Talking about academia. But again, of course, this is very generalized. Of course, we find exceptions everywhere to this. Exceptions to this rule in the field of history, of course, are historians like Martin Broschardt, Helmut Krausnick, Werner Jochmann, who had been old enough to take part in the war, but young enough of not having been part of the regime, and who, at the end of the 1950s, started research about the NS regime, about anti-Semitism, and about the Holocaust, often in the context of one of the great trials where they served as external experts. So there was a trial, then Wolfgang Schäffler, another of this generation, was asked to give a kind of expertise on this, and then later made a book out of it. At that time, in the early 1960s, the focus of their historical work was to understand how could it happen, and the it being, however, the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the National Socialist takeover of power, and not so much the mass killings themselves. In the same line, it was not until the late 1960s and early 70s, and the writings of a slightly younger generation of scholars, like the late Hans Mommsen, for example, that there was a critical confrontation with Nazi rule itself, the functionaries, the elites, and those who profited. At the same time, but somehow in a completely different field, and we can talk about it in the discussion if you're interested, at the same time, the early 70s, Jewish history came back to Germany, inspired by German Jewish remigrants from the Leo Baeck Institute mainly, and taken up by a very small minority of historians at that time. So 2 things are important, I think, to note here. The famous generation of 1968, even though they loudly protested against fascist and imperialist structure of West Germany, were not very much interested in detail in confronting the Nazi past. Their impact was rather an indirect one, as far as long-term general liberalization of society is concerned. But of course, this, let's say, opening of the windows and letting in fresh air did not happen from one day to the other. And in order to illustrate this, let me share with you a very small anecdote from my own youth that I spent in Munich in the 1970s, going to school in nearby Dachau, where the first West German memorial site had been established on the ground of the former concentration camp in the mid-60s. At that time, in the 1970s, it was compulsory for all Munich school children to go to Dachau in grade 8, that is when you were like 14, I think, and it was part of the religious education class, not of history or politics or whatever. And our Catholic teacher, the local priest of Dachau, however, refused to take us there to the memorial site because it was all Allied propaganda, as he said. So officially we were never taken there. And that was at the gymnasium in Dachau in 1976. Just to explain to you that things change slowly and take turns. Only 2 years later, in 1978, the German streaming of the Hollywood miniseries Holocaust gave rise to the first big public debate on Jewish victims. So while on the one hand, I would always insist in the longue durée of social processes and the even longer of mentality change, as we heard this morning by Gesine Schwan, there are certain events that, at least in hindsight, appear as milestones. And this TV series, which was extremely criticized as being Hollywood and so on, but this, for Germany, this miniseries was one milestone in our coming to terms with the past. But again, at the same time, we have to take a generational shift into account. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the interest of a new generation had turned to local history in general, to the history of day-to-day life, to the history of the common man and woman. And inspired by a high political moral impetus, this alternative Heimatforscher, home story historians, local hometown, home region history, something like this, they started digging where they were living. That was the phrase, dig where you live, dig where you stand. And in the course of those digs, it was hardly surprising that the first materials they excavated were from the local Nazi past, under their feet and in their own locality. Jewish life, persecution and resistance, slave work, and concentration camps became their most frequent topics. This form of approaching the Nazi past reached a clear first high point in 1988, with the 50th anniversary of the pogroms of November 9, of the Reichskristallnacht from 1938, and its ardor of remembrance in both Germanys, by the way. Never before and never after that did so many publications on the Nazi past appear towards one single date than in that year, in 1988, which is 50 years after the events, one must remember. So in the political sphere, this development of the late 1980s had been escorted by one of the most influential speeches of a West German head of state, and we heard about it this morning, but I will repeat my version of Richard von Weizsäcker, the official statement of Richard von Weizsäcker on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. in which, as we heard, he defined the 8th of May as a day of defeat but also of liberation. The fact that this word liberation at that time triggered off a heated debate only shows the long way we have traveled ever since. And for sure, one should not forget that already 15 years before Weizsäcker's speech, Willy Brandt, then Chancellor of the Federal Republic, had gone down on his knees in order to pay tribute to the murdered Jews of the ghetto of Warsaw. But Brandt was a politician of the left and an emigrant and a resistance fighter, so it was easy to dismiss his gesture as leftist politics in the context of the very heatedly debated Ostpolitics. It was Weizsäcker, the offspring of an influential German noble family that had been highly involved, or parts of them, in Nazi politics, that was to set another milestone in condemning this shared past as evil, and the defeat of Germany consequently as something positive. When he was giving that speech, no one possibly imagined that only 5 years later, the most striking result of that defeat, namely the partition of Germany, was about to come to an end. Luckily, only then, one must say today, was a generation of Nazi perpetrators finally retired, a rising social interest in the past, and a clear statement by official German politics, the newly united Germany was able to prove its internal democratic stability and external peacefulness by positioning its coming to terms with the past as its political founding fundament. Since 1990, then, the Vergangenheitspolitik, politics of the past, or a certain model culture of dealing with this past, serves as a raison d'etat in Germany. Memorial sites, commemoration days, monuments, museums, university chairs, research institutions like mine, which was founded before, were remodeled or newly established. A huge amount of money was invested in these different forms of educational, cultural, and political projects, accompanied by widespread debates in the academic and in the public sphere. Now, once in a while, a scandal still rocks this culture, a controversial book or an exhibition or something a person says, but in general, I think these are quite foreseeable disputes on a kind of cultural meta level that do not really hurt anyone anymore, given the fact, by the way, that almost everyone active in the 1930s and 40s is dead by now. This more or less perfect state of things, in my eyes, however, has led to new challenges. If everything is an officially state-sponsored project, what then is the role of civil society in history politics, and where is room for, let's say, youthful counterculture engagement to mark itself off from the establishment? This feeling of saturation, of we know everything and the Nazi past is boring, and come on, we've been hearing this at school like for many, many years, this is quite widespread among the younger generation, and as far as I can see, our excellent educational programs have not really found an answer to this saturation feeling. I'm convinced that this coming to terms with one's past is a process that has to be appropriated anew by each generation, and there has to be a space for a younger generation to appropriate this, which is maybe lacking. It has to be appropriated by each generation in different ways, on different terms, and with different medial and cultural expressions. So I don't know, but we might be at the start, or maybe rather in the middle, of a new perspective on that past, one that deals with old new topics such as nationalism, the role of religious difference, the definition of Europe, its borders, and its inhabitants. And I think this is all open to discussion, but before we can start the discussion, and at the end of my talk here now, I would like to state just one thing. As you might have noticed, I have not mentioned the term reconciliation yet, and that was given to me like in the title of my talk by the organizers, and I did not mention it for several reasons. First of all, I think that this term does not fit the story of Germany and its Nazi past, but would rather fit a civil war setting like Spain, or maybe countries which have a heavy terrorist past like Northern Ireland or the Basque Country. Nazi Germany was by and large a dictatorship based on social consent, in different range and intensity and over the time, but still. So the term reconciliation might rather make sense when looking at Germany's relationships to other countries, to its neighbors, but this is not our topic here, this is a topic of European integration. This is not to forget, however, that there was an opposition to the Nazis within Germany, and quite a numerous one. Let's not forget that the parties of the left, the Social Democrats and the Communists taken together, had gained almost 40% in the last 3 elections of 33. And this opposition, or its members, were from 1933 onwards consequently driven into exile, imprisoned or killed in concentration camps, some tens of thousands of Germans. So in some way it was a partition of Germany into 2 states, one the official successor state of Nazi Germany, one the official successor state of the other Germany, the Germany of the opponents to the Nazi regime. It was this partition, and last but not least the Cold War, that prevented by and large a real internal reconciliation within the German in the German society, with the German political victims of the fascist dictatorship. And I think this is a social void that can still be felt until today between East and West Germany, and which will now be a topic of the talk of my dear colleague, Dorothee Wierling. Thank you very much.
Oops. Thank you very much, Stefanie, for handing over to me. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really very, very happy to be here, part of this conference. As Stefanie, I've never been in Ukraine before, so I know already that I have learned already, beginning yesterday evening with the New Year's party. I will learn and have learned with the conference, and so my curiosity, I know, will be satisfied. Thank you very much for the introduction, Martin Schulze Wessel. I have been asked to talk about the ways in which Germans dealt with the German Democratic Republic, GDR, as a past they had to come to terms with under the heading of reconciliation. And I found this a real challenge for reasons which I hope will become obvious during my talk. The case of the communist GDR and its implosion in the fall of 1989 is unique, in particular because there was not just a regime, but a state itself which came to an end. On the other hand, this state was not a nation state in the strict sense of the word, but was incorporated into one that claimed to represent the shared history as a nation. These peculiarities had a direct and important impact on the ways the communist past was dealt with. In my talk, I will proceed in 5 steps. I think it's 5. The number changed while I was writing, so bear with me if it's not correct. In 5 steps to create some kind of order from what was a most confusing situation and in many ways still is. I will begin with looking at 1945 and 1989 as moments of historical break experienced less as an end, but a beginning. I will then analyze encounters and confrontations between East and West Germans in the early years after unification and look at the impact these had on discourses on the GDR as a problematic past, both on the level of public and private discourses. I too will in the end question the usefulness of the concept of reconciliation for understanding these conflicts about the GDR past. And I will discuss what I regard as flaws of history politics when it comes to establish a dominant discourse on the GDR as a meaningful past. Let me add that my take on all this is that of a social historian and an oral historian. The project that was mentioned of the birth cohort of 1949 was to a large degree an oral history project that is based on biographical interviews, on autobiographical interviews. And it was in a way a follow-up project to an oral history project that was really interesting, which I conducted together with Lutz Niethammer and Alexander von Plaute in 1987 in the GDR, when the GDR still existed, at the time with birth cohorts from 1900 to 1930, so that I have an image, or I think a sort of an understanding about generational experiences of change. As a social historian, I strongly believe in the vitality of society even under dictatorships. Real people interacting, communicating, developing social practices and historical meaning. They matter much more than state politics when it comes to make sense of the past. And finally, I ask your forbearance regarding the crudeness of the following arguments. It is a complicated issue, and I have very little time. And so I decided to be as clear as possible and leave all differentiation to your comments and to the discussion. Okay, I'm sorry to do some water. Okay. 1945 is generally seen as the most important historical rupture in the European, in particular in the German 20th century. The war was lost, the fascist state and its protagonists at the end. Violence was extreme and unregulated, millions on the way, life as it was known was over. In another respect, however, there was also continuity, and that is a continuity you learn about when you interview people who lived through these breaks. Early on, the Soviets, for example, offered the Germans under their power to cooperate and join forces to build a new society. While this meant a complete break in regard to ideological essence, they at the same time provided power institutions and relations which resembled the structures of the Nazi dictatorship. Especially young Germans, young at the time in 1945, in the Soviet zone, were attracted by the offer of a substitute ideology, hermetic, closed, organizations, authoritarian organizations, and charismatic leadership figures. Their life histories often focused around conversion from Nazi to communist around this break. The youth organization Free German Youth offered a new sense of collectivism and empowerment. Stalin, for many, took over the position of Hitler, by whom they felt abandoned and betrayed. And it was this generation, born in the second half of the 1920s, who were offered not only forgiveness, but also an education and social upward mobility when they began to fill positions of former Nazis, such as teachers or judges, professions that had been heavily Nazified, or those positions created in the course of socialist state building, like in the socialist administration or socialist mass organizations. In any event, 1945 was not the moment to look back, but to look ahead, and while insisting on a total break with the past, build on the past at the same time in a tacit agreement. Nor was 1989 a year of confronting the past. The collapse of the GDR had been caused by the mass exodus of mostly young East Germans to the west via Hungary's newly opened borders and then through Austria. And this was all about the future, about a life with personal freedoms, to travel, to move, to read and speak out without censorship, to consume Western goods with Western currency. Although these freedoms are linked to democracy, these were mostly dreams about a good life, independent of a political motivation in the strict sense of the word, or in the emphatic sense of the word. While blaming the secret police Stasi and the Communist Party SED for their misery and the many restrictions in their daily lives, East Germans initially did not expect to be blamed themselves for having lived under and coped with the communist regime. The weeks after were characterized by a euphoria mixed with growing anxiety about the possible effects of the breakdown of the GDR. Some concerned East Germans' possible association with the regime. Just give you rough numbers, 20% of the adult population had been a member of the Communist Party in the last years of the GDR. During all of its history, an estimated 600,000 people had served the secret police as so-called informal informers. So we're not talking about official members of the Stasi. Millions had been members and hundreds of thousands had held functions, although low functions, in various socialist mass organizations. And it was in this connection that many East Germans began to consider the past. But their orientation was the future, I believe. How would they be able to successfully change into Germans just like the West Germans, to build a future for themselves and leave the GDR behind? All these questions became more pressing when encounters of East and West Germans became a common feature of everyday life in the beginning of the 1990s. And here, I mean, I won't talk about myself, but I was part of this because I went to Leipzig in the April of 1990 for a couple of years. On the one hand, East Germans traveled to the West to visit their relatives and see the places and cities of their longing. On the other hand, West Germans invaded the East, sent by the West German federal and various state governments to oversee the political and administrative changes in the East, to evaluate institutions, companies, and their respective personnel, in other words, to decide who would keep or lose their jobs, and to establish branches of Western companies, be it banks, supermarket chains, or industrial plants. The so-called Treuhand functioned as an overarching West German holding company for all of the former people's companies, including the agricultural corporations. West German professors took over vacated chairs at the universities, etc., etc. As a result, West Germans became extremely powerful, not always, but often only for the sheer fact of being West Germans. Their perspective on East Germans was characterized by a mix of positive engagement, curiosity, contempt, and disgust, while a mixture of assiduity, resentment, and good humor came from the side of East Germans. These were encounters dominated by mutual strangeness, combined with a clear power imbalance. The West provided the model to be copied and followed by the East. East Germans were different. They were the others, while West Germans saw themselves as the real, the ultimate Germans. This initial relationship and mutual perception was also the basis for the public discourse about the GDR as a problematic past. The West German public was very much concerned with these new Germans who would become part of the common nation state. They seemed more authoritarian, the East Germans, seemed more authoritarian in character, conformist, xenophobic, and less liberal, tolerant, and less willing to accept rules of the democratic game. Repeated opinion polls confirmed the East German otherness. The mutual estrangement, West Germans claimed, was due to the fact that they, the West Germans, had gone through the rebellious experience of 1968, while the East Germans had not. No surprise that this historical argument was made in particular by West German 1968ers. In their eyes, East Germans lagged behind and misbehaved because they had grown up in a political system of an overall repressive character. This system had not just made them victims, but also collaborators, conformists, and to a large degree even perpetrators, given the high percentage of participation in the repressive regime apparatus. I mean, I know I'm simplifying, but I want to make the point of the West German take on this. Early on, this public discourse of what the GDR was and what life had been like in the GDR was dominated by West Germans on the one side, assisted by members of the opposition movement in the GDR. The focus on, often the reduction to, political repression as the essence of GDR everyday experience meant an ambivalent offer to the East Germans. On the one hand, they could claim that the victimized could not be blamed. On the other, the definition of who was a protagonist of repression could be extended to the most basic commitment. And finally, the concept of victim is in itself ambiguous. While it absolves from historical responsibility, it denies individuals under this category any agency and thus dignity. As a consequence, the focus on the repressive apparatus was not well received in the East in general, nor was the label of second dictatorship, which alluded to the fascist regime as the absolute evil and German historical guilt. After all, many East Germans still did believe in the anti-fascist founding narrative of the GDR. And last but not least, the Western definition of the GDR as basic rule of injustice, Unrechtsstaat, gave proof, in the eyes of most East Germans, of Western ignorance and arrogance. But West Germans were proud of their achievements in coming to terms with the past of Nazi Germany. I refer to Stefanie's talk just now, and they were determined to do it even better, more thorough, and without further delay in the case of the GDR. Meanwhile, East Germans developed their own discourses on the past. They did it in private and often only amongst themselves. We can see a number of narrative communities developing around the topic of GDR times. Narrative communities of former elites, like former military or former ambassadors, would meet at specific places and really talk through. Families, neighbors, colleagues, both employed and unemployed. The stories they told each other or reminded each other of were sometimes outright nostalgic and apologetic, often using the genre of droll stories, Schwank. The attempt to fend off memories of defeat or shame were obvious. People knew about the impossibility to neatly distinguish between foe and friend, perpetrator and victim. The moral ambiguity of their stories reflected the tacit knowledge of the basic ambiguity of their lives under socialism. The presence of a West German would often silence them, certainly if he or she, that is the West German, demonstrated outright moral superiority. This unwillingness to engage in the debates about the GDR as a problematic past had another powerful motivation. While the GDR was delegitimized, I always have a problem with this word, it's too many syllables, delegitimized by West Germans, mostly on the political level, the West was being delegitimized from the perspective of East Germans in the realm of economic and social conditions. Capitalism had hit hard. The West was a powerful partner, which, however, often used its power to its own advantage at the cost of the East. East Germans saw themselves as second-class Germans or second-class citizens, while West Germans regarded the Easterners as ungrateful, thus confirming the social imbalance between the two groups. As a result, insisting that not everything was bad in the GDR became a common phrase to defend one's own experience against the ruthless arrogance of the West. Again, it was a historical argument used to claim the right for self-definition in the present situation. As another result, there was a growing and broad ex post identification with the GDR in the East, that is, among East Germans. Before 1989, there had been a clear distinction in the way people talked, a clear distinction between society or people on the one hand, culminating in the slogan, "We are the people" in 1989, and the state on the other, which had defined the sense of we or us. So when GDR citizens before 1989 talked about we, it was society. It was, as a rule, not the state, if they weren't SED functionaries. Now, these distinctions between we as society and they or them as state, these distinctions became blurred and even dissolved in the East German discourses to the same degree, post-war discourses, to the same degree the very existence of a society had been denied in the Western discourse about the totalitarian state. I mean, there is a way of talking about the totalitarian state that denies the existence of a dynamic society. Never had the approval of and the support for the GDR been as strong as it was in the first years after its implosion. I wonder if this mess is adequately dealt with as a matter of reconciliation. Reconciliation takes place between adversaries to overcome injustice between them. This basic constellation hardly applies to the German case. It does not fit the situation East and West Germans found themselves in after 1989. The fact that after 1945 each group found themselves in very different conditions was neither their fault nor their merit, but sheer luck or misfortune. As an East German interviewee told us West German historians in 1987, "You won the war, we lost it." And obviously he was right. Nor is there a clear divide between those who were on the side of power and the others who were on the side of the powerless. In the political system of the GDR, a very small number of people had real power. Most of the political actors were positioned somewhere in between, representing the power vis-à-vis those below, and held responsible from above for the successful implementation of decisions which were not their own and for which they often had not been given the means. This awkward situation often led to a reversal of formal hierarchies. At the same time, party membership linked to careers subjected individuals to a special disciplinary system, the party discipline, without the benefit of substantial privileges whatsoever. And finally, party membership could, for instance, in working class milieus, make you right away an outcast. As a consequence, careers in the late GDR, especially in the late GDR, were avoided, and in many ways, it were the working class and marginal groups, like Christian communities, which enjoyed the most possible freedom and personal independence in the GDR. Since the vast majority of East Germans in the end were unpolitical, I think to become more and more depoliticized was one of the major results of political propaganda, and instead were unpolitical, kept low profile, and instead developed a widespread attitude of grumbling, as the British historian Mary Fulbrook had said. Only a minority became subject to direct repressive intervention of the state apparatus. And these interventions could be extremely painful and destructive, and many of those who suffered from Stasi or other repression did confront the perpetrators after 1990. These were initiatives similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but they were more on a private or, less formal basis. From what I know, I talked to people who went through these conversations, and I once was present at one of those conversations. They could have a cathartic effect on the side of the victims, less on the side of the perpetrator, but very often they did not. In any event, these initiatives cannot serve as a model for coming to terms with the past of the GDR for the broad population. The experience which affected each citizen of the GDR, however, I believe, was the continuous assault on their pride and dignity. Lying, taking part in rituals you did not believe in, fear to stand by friends and colleagues in trouble, being publicly humiliated, humiliating yourself to get favors which you should have had the right to claim, being blackmailed into cooperating with the state. In retrospect, therefore, feelings of shame are common, shame about personal weaknesses and memories of humiliation. In this sense, shame refers, that's how I use it, shame refers to the injured self, other than guilt, which refers to injuries inflicted on others. If this observation is valid, then the concept of reconciliation does not fit the basic social experience for the majority of East Germans. Given this messy situation on the ground, messy like psychological and personal emotional things are always messy, the efforts on the side of political pedagogy to establish a shared and even binding narrative of the GDR past are a failure for various reasons. And when I talk about political pedagogy, I know that this takes place in a democratic and pluralistic state, but there is an enormous moral pressure for a specific way of talking about the past, and that's what I refer to. First, history politics tend to seek clarity. I think that's a general rule, while the experiences of most people are characterized by ambiguity. Secondly, the focus on repression may even intensify or repeat the earlier shaming experience instead of empowering the self. One reaction may be to produce counter-narratives which also lack complexity and serve as a mere denial of repression. Finally, some of the methods of history politics in Germany, in post-war Germany, remind in an embarrassing way of the GDR propaganda methods, not the content, but the methods themselves. Thus, the attempt to enforce the use of a specific language, or rather specific terms, which claim exclusive legitimacy for the GDR, I personally find absolutely insulting. One example is the already mentioned Unrechtsstaat, rule of injustice, that people were, I don't know if they still are, but they were for a while pressed to confess to. And I want to express my deepest respect to our keynote speaker of this morning, that she refused to bow to this dictate, although it meant she would not be elected president of Germany. Okay, that was very important for me, this gesture. I'm sorry, I've just opened. Okay. The other example is the definition of the late 1989 events as peaceful revolution. And I got alarmed when I saw that it was in capital letters. So it's not Friedliche Revolution, which should be small letters, but it's, peaceful generation with a capital P. Although I agree that this is a possible way of defining what happened, it is the insistence on the term that makes me refuse it. And it's a mixture of I can see myself being infantilized by this, but I think, I really think that I have an important point here. This is not the way to come to terms with the past. The attempt to create one binding meaning in a historical narrative is in itself undemocratic. East Germans who are used to complying with language rules will certainly see the embarrassing continuities. In way of conclusion, I would like to suggest that instead of reconciliation, it is a disposition of recognition that we need. That is, to develop an understanding of the German Cold War history in unified Germany by recognition, which does not mean to deny or ignore injustice or repression. The historical culture, I imagine, is based on the recognition of different historical constellations and thus experiences of various injuries, losses, and gains, of multiple errors and achievements under the circumstances that were seldom of one's own choice. And I here obviously, relate to what you said this morning. Understanding that people's experiences vary according to class, gender, generation, and many other factors is very important. In the 1990s, I think, a group of Israeli and Palestinian teachers met regularly to create a common textbook about the history of their region since 1945. The book would give there was a book. A book was a result of these negotiations, and it was laid out in a very peculiar way. It would give the narrative of one side on one page, or like a column, and then the narrative of the other side concerning the same event, the Palestinian, on the other in a column. And in between, there was a large blank space. And the idea of the blank space was not to tell students that they had to fill it, but to realize, the largeness of the gap, and also to read the other stories, just to acknowledge, that this was another story based on another experience. Now, it does not come as a surprise that this book was never introduced in schools, neither in Israel nor in the Palestinian territories. Now, I thought, what if we think of East and West Germany or the various states in East and West Germany, or such a book for the Ukraine. And my first question is not what would be in these columns, but how many columns would we need? Okay, thank you. Shall we sit here?
Thank you very much for the two very interesting papers, rich papers and valuable contributions to our conference. I think they were very clear. You made your point, and therefore it would be a waste of time to sum them up. And you said that you will leave, that you left the relativizations to the discussion. I think this will be our task. And in this sense, I have one question to both of you. You both stressed that the two German dictatorships, which are difficult, of course, to compare or should not be compared, that they are similar in one point, that is, they were based on a very broad consensus. The NS dictatorship and the GDR dictatorship as well, and therefore there were the situation for reconciliation was not given in that sense. But anyway, there were social democrats, communists, there were even some Catholics who were against the Nazi dictatorship, and maybe we should not use the concept reconciliation because it includes a catharsis and because it has a religious dimension, of course. But we could use the concept common ground. How could, for example, in the German Bundestag, in the German Parliament, representatives who had been perpetrators and representatives who had been victims, how could they find on an everyday level a common ground? Or in small villages, for example, in the village where I live, it's a really tiny village, and there was living von Manstein, who was the commander of the Heeresgruppe Mitte, and at the same time there was one of the representatives, the family, he himself was killed, but the family of one of the representatives of the 20th of July. And in this small village, how could they live together at the end? And the same question, of course, concerns also the situation after 1989. I understood that this distinction between perpetrators and victims is not very sensible, but anyway, there were people who were more involved and less involved, and how could they find a common ground in social situations? And then there's one other reflection. Well, I think it's good that you left out international relations, but with regard to Poland, to Ukraine, to Belarus, to Russia, to Greece, and so on, there's no championship in German coming to terms with with the past. Most of us, most Germans, do know very little about, for example, the siege of Leningrad or the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 and many other things, as you know. And this, I think, has also a very harmful impact on the internal situation, which is the issue of our debates today. As you know, we have one project, one history policy project in Germany. It's about expulsion, flight expulsion, reconciliation. It has even the terminus reconciliation in it, and it's about the refugees which fled from the eastern parts of Germany or other parts of Eastern Europe to Western or Eastern Germany after 1945. And it's interesting that this word reconciliation is really not reflected in this project. It's not clear whether it's a reconciliation with Poland or Russia or Ukraine. I think this is not meant by the people who planned this project. But it's a reconciliation of the Germans with themselves. It's a reconciliation of the Germans who did not flee, who were inhabitants of Western or Eastern Germany after 1945, with the refugees which came from Eastern Germany, that is from the historical Eastern Germany or from other parts of Eastern Europe. And I think this is still an open debate which demands also to come at the end to come to terms with the historical relations of Germany with Ukraine, with Belarus and other countries in the Second World War, which has not really been done so far. So would you like to answer? And then we will open the floor for open discussion.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. Maybe that's why this Stiftung Flucht, Vertreibung, Versöhnung with the reconciliation in this doesn't have a director and doesn't have an exhibition for many, many years, because they haven't been very clear on that. But that's just a joke aside. How did they find a common ground after the war? I think that would be a topic for a conference. I think it's something that I'm asking myself, and the more I'm dealing with the immediate post-war decades, the more uncanny it gets, the more unbelievable it gets that somehow they live together. And I think one of the basics was not to speak about the past, but to concentrate on the future. And this goes for both sides. I mean, there are these wonderful, I don't know who knows these interviews, but that David Boder conducted in post-war Europe with survivors from the Holocaust, where he is asking these young boys mainly in 1945 and 46 and 47, and you can listen to it in the internet. I can give you the heading. And it's really impressive. First of all, it's young voices. We always think of survivors as old people because we see them now on the television. But it's 16, 17 years old who want to talk about the future. He's asking about their experiences, and they don't really want to tell. They want to tell what they want to do now in the future and how to rebuild their lives. So I think this was one general atmosphere. And of course we have to, this is very simply to recognize the fact that the Jews were dead or driven into exiles, and only 2 or 3% of German Jews came back, of those who had survived. And tens of thousands of communists and social democrats were dead. So, I mean, there were many who just couldn't live together anymore after the war. It was their families, yes. And I think silence was one way of dealing with this. And if you were like, maybe it was a little bit different if I think about people I know personally. Once you were a member of a party, like in West Germany, of the Social Democratic Party, for example, they had a joint political program for the future, and they had a joint bottom line, which was social democracy, which I think also helped, to overcome this gap of those who came from the outside and those who had stayed inside and those who newly joined the party, because it was a new political project directed to the future. I think this projecting yourself into the future was one way of living together. And but we must not forget that those, like the Fritz Bauer I mentioned, or also Josef Wolf, who was a historian who killed himself in 1973 after having published many, many books on the Holocaust that no one read or recognized, not even in the historical academia. So they are victims of this silence as well. And I'm mentioning Fritz Bauer now all the time because, he is somehow rediscovered now after so many years, but he died a lonely person. And I think he was not the only one. So it took its toll. That's maybe the bottom line of my talk. Even though in the end it came out well, after 50 or 60 years, it took a heavy toll of many victims who were not recognized and who died alone. And that goes for the second question as far as international relations concerned. I think this is the toll of the Cold War. That Leningrad or Belarus or Ukraine was not really recognized, and the victims were not really recognized for so many years. We talked about it this morning. And the interesting case is Greece, because Greece was not part of the Soviet bloc, but now with the crisis and the heavy reaction in Greece towards the German politics, was always Angela Merkel with the swastika, it was like the surprise. Why are they so offended, because there's not at all, and there's no consciousness in Germany about what the Germans did in Greece. This is a complete laguna, and it will take another, 20 years maybe.
Yeah, well, is it on? You can hear me, okay. Well, first of all, the GDR regime never enjoyed, at no point in its history, enjoyed the same consensus than did Nazi Germany. I mean, there are no exact polls, obviously, but I think there's no debate about that among historians. And the high point of the consent with the GDR regime was actually in the 1970s. And that was due to a change in politics, which kind of allowed for a depoliticization of the public sphere on the one hand, and in a way, bribed the population with a very, very generous social policies. And it was at this point that and that we know already from, more or less a representative polls that were taken in the GDR itself. But as we know, that was the cost of, that was actually the beginning of the end, because at a moment where the GDR regime was no longer in the position to pay for these social policies, that was the end of the consent. But the fact that there is this re-identification with the GDR has actually little to do, I think, with the amount of consensus during the GDR history itself. As to the common ground of former adversaries or perpetrators, victims, I think probably I would come up with a similar explanation that you gave, although there was the possibility, and I think that is actually a very big achievement to build up this Stasi archive, which enables people who either really did become victims or suspect that they were victims to go and see their files. I think that is very important. I'm all for it. And it was done on a mass basis. It was used. But as far as I can see, this knowledge that people were able to acquire did not lead to a broad discussion about what did you do between 1945 and 1989 in the East German population as such. And I think it has something, that is the presence of the West, not because the West was mean, when it's not, but the fact that there was a state and a very relatively perfect apparatus that took over this whole issue. In a way, disempower is not a word, right? But you know what I mean. Offered itself to become active and led to, I think, of a kind of passivity and made everybody an object of these policies, perpetrators as well as victims. I'm not criticizing this because I have a better idea what to have to. It's just that's just what happened, okay? And let me just. But again, I think there was I talked to people from villages where they know who was the Stasi informant in the village. They know each other. And they still go on their daily routine and try not to hurt each other, which is really interesting. Just a last point about the international dimension of this. When we did our interviews in the GDR in 1987, Lutz Niethammer wrote a very interesting article because it became obvious that West Germans had made a totally different choice from East Germans when it came to define the one ultimate victim group. In West Germany, this was Jews. In East Germany, it weren't Jews. It was Soviet prisoners and Soviet slave workers. They were the ultimate victims. And it was through them that, you know, the responsibility and the criminality of the Nazi regime was exemplified. And so I think that East Germans actually had the sense that they had done their tribute to these crimes in Eastern Europe. I'm not saying that this was the case, but that was the self-perception, I think.
Can I just to add one small remark because I'm living part-time in a very small village in East Germany, and you are right that they know each other. They know exactly who had what position and who was Stasi member and whatever, and they live together and fine. But as soon as there's a conflict about something completely different, then this comes up and it's being functionalized. And by the way, he was from the Stasi. So it's there and it is being used, you know, when necessary.
It's like the party said, the party forgives but doesn't forget.
Nor does the village.
Nor does the village, exactly.
Okay. The floor is open for questions. Holy case, please.
First of all, I want to say I found this very interesting. I'm really enjoying this conference so far. My question is to the both of you, and it's about Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And it's sort of an abstract question, but it's one that I've never quite found a satisfactory answer to in all of my confrontations with it. And that is, what are the fundamental premises of Vergangenheitsbewältigung? It seems to me as if one of those fundamental premises is sort of Freudian, that if something is repressed, it's going to pop out somewhere anyway. And so you have to sort of do a fundamental psychoanalytic undertaking in order to bring it to the surface. And once you've done that, there's a kind of medicinal power that Vergangenheitsbewältigung has. And if you don't do it, that thing is going to take its revenge in some other form. But it seems to me as though when confronted, if, let's say, this deep metaphorical psychoanalysis is undertaken, the closer one comes to absolutely understanding, the more distant one gets from the original purpose for which one undertook Vergangenheitsbewältigung. For example, Stefanie, you said something wonderful in your talk. You mentioned the opening up and letting fresh air in, that there was a period when this stuffiness was all of a sudden sort of dissolved, and that this closed environment became open. And it seems as though that feeling was very much of its time, whereas the feeling now that I get from Vergangenheitsbewältigung is very different. Namely, if you look at Generation War, unsere Mütter, unsere Väter, that the desire is almost to look at this generation as something connected rather than to sort of push it away, wait for it to die. It's sort of anxious that it's going to die and trying to figure out what the passing of this generation could possibly mean. And in that process, it seems as though if you watch that film, the character you end up sympathizing the most with is technically the one who does the worst stuff. And it's partly what the original impetus behind Vergangenheitsbewältigung was to, recognize we've done something wrong, whereas the current one seems to be, if the closer you come to a fine-grained understanding, the farther you get from an intentionalist interpretation. And the closer you come to a functionalist interpretation, which means that sort of contrast between the former self and the now self starts to dissolve. And maybe that's not a problem. Maybe that's sort of what you were talking about, that every generation has to do Vergangenheitsbewältigung on its own terms. But my question is basically, is there a danger implicit in these developments, or can there be a danger implicit in these developments, or is that just the sort of the next thing on this road? And it's okay to have a super functionalist interpretation. It's even okay to understand how someone could go from this to that, to that, and to feel like one, oh, okay, I get it now that my grandfather did these things.
Francis.
Yes. First, as you commented on why Germans had to accept, because of the outcome of the war, criminality, etc., of course you mentioned the Allies, and of course you're perfectly correct, they were the Allies, one of whom many would view as a criminal state in itself, or having criminality in it. I was struck with that because I almost had the reaction when the Allies said, perfectly true. But I noticed Cold War only came in very late in our discussion in one of the questions, and I thought that in the entire discussion of why things operated the way they did, of course, the Soviet Union and the relative crimes or non-crimes of the Soviet Union, I think, have to play a prominent role. What I also wondered when we talked about East Germany, there were considerable forces in West Germany who were enablers of the East German state. That is, to what degree have they come to terms with their past? That is, those forces in West German society, for whichever reason, wanted to downplay some of the negative aspects of the East German state. Is there any internal discussion or rethinking of them, or coming together of West Germans who were on opposite sides and how they would have treated East Germany and that regime as well?
Dariusz Stoller.
Thank you very much for this excellent paper. It's really fascinating, and I would like to come to the end of Stefanie's paper. You said that at the moment of unification, the West Germans have already gone through a longer process of coming to terms, and they were very eager to impose. But this is, I think, was there a dilemma that the communists in the Soviet satellites had in the 1940s? Namely, they wanted to have a communist regime, and the question was, should we imitate the Soviet process, you mean NEP, and only then radicalize the revolution, or should we impose the present final result of the Soviet process, namely the Soviet model of the late 1940s? Was there an idea that maybe in East Germany it will also take time, that there must be a period of a relative suspension of criticism of the past to consolidate the society? Oh, there was just the eagerness, let's introduce the final result out of it. And second, when you mentioned that many of East Germans somehow delegated the question of dealing with the past on the public institutions, that was my understanding. Didn't they do the same in East Germany when thinking about the Nazi past? So they simply responded in a way they had trained back in the communist era. That would be very rational. When you have a government imposing on you a policy on the past, well, and you have a pattern of response, which is relatively safe. So there is a continuity, if I'm correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
These were, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4 very complex questions. So if I'm not, good enough with my answers, you can remind me. I'm just okay. First, Sally. Well, I think that first of all, the German term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is translated as coming to terms with the past, but is also like mastering the past. I think that's the title that that was also used by, what's his name? Okay, our Harvard friend, yes. Anyway, is a bad term. We shouldn't use it. But as so often we use terms because they're just there, but it's not a good term. I think what I mean is actually attempts to deal with the past. And that can have, various forms, and it can, also shift and change, and it has not this ultimate goal that there will be a mastered past. So in that sense, although I have no issue with looking at this in Freudian terms, this is not a psychoanalytical treatment that will end after 5 years, and, patient will be happy. Especially since Freud said that psychoanalysis is there to change neurotic unhappiness into normal unhappiness, which I always loved as a phrase. Anyway, I really think that what I think is important and actually happens is a search for the truth. I think that sounds very pathos-mäßig, but it is important. You don't find the truth, but what you want as a child, want a specific, a minimum of honesty. And if I may, I will be a very short story. My father was born in 1910. He was a simple soldier. He went to the war. He went everywhere, and he came home very happy and well nourished from the Danish so-called Cream Front. And I had never suspected him of anything bad, actually, but he had just never talked about the atrocities on the Eastern Front. And so a few months before his death, we came in a very harmless conversation, and I asked him about the German exhibition of the so-called Wehrmachtsausstellung, about the atrocities of the army, of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. And he said, no, yeah, he had heard about it, but he never wanted to go to this exhibition. And then he was silent, and then he just said, he told me in 2 sentences, he told me the story that when he was wounded the second time, he was in a military hospital, and there was another person who bragged about what he did and how he had killed people, and what he did with the corpse and everything. And my father was shocked, and that was it. And so I felt absolutely relieved, because it was a moment of acknowledgement. My father had known what had happened, and I realized that was all I wanted from him, really. It was a wonderful moment, actually. And that's what I mean. It's a moment of honesty, of recognition. And I think that's the most important thing. And it doesn't mean to come to terms with the past, but be able to handle it in a way that doesn't drive you crazy. The attraction with this generation of war is a very interesting feature, and I have various thoughts about it. I think one possible explanation could be that my generation, born in 1950, was extremely confrontative with the parents, and I never actually wanted to know what my parents had to tell me about it, because what they told were all victim stories, obviously, and I didn't believe a word, and I really confronted them very harshly, and then there was silence, and then I grew up. And I think there is a kind of impetus in my generation to somehow make good for that. That may be one explanation. The other explanation is less nice, actually, and that is that more and more I get the impression that many of the younger generation are extremely attracted to the stories of the violent first half of the 20th century, and think of their own history, the peaceful, more or less well consumer society history is just too boring, and there is a kind of obsession that has a lot to do with this attraction to violence, and I think that's one of can be difficult to discuss, but I think that there might be another point in that. Okay, I think it was Frank. Yeah, yes, anti-fascism in. There you are. Sorry. Anti-fascism came as Stalinism, absolutely, in East Germany. You're absolutely right, and that's actually what I wanted to allude to. That you could be as a young East German who wanted to convert. You could be an anti-fascist, and at the same time take over structures that were totalitarian in a way, although I don't like the word very much. But this anti-fascism, in this sense, did not have a liberating character to it, absolutely. It was extremely repressive, yeah? But it hit people who were on the ground and who were used to repression, and in a way knew how to deal with it. But this anti-fascism was in itself a repressive and brutal, or based on a repressive and brutal system. The other question that you asked, some of the debates that I didn't touch upon about what the GDR was, were political debates that were not between West and East Germans, but were among West Germans of different political traditions. And the group of historians and political scientists, I assume, and sociologists who had, in one way or other, worked on the GDR was, especially in the early 1990s, extremely split according to political camps. And personally, I thought that was very unproductive, actually. And because, it was difficult to, okay, anyway, the camps also, worked as kind of ideological cages in many ways. That's what I mean when I say it was pretty unproductive. That has actually changed. And I think it has led to more openness in the debates about the GDR, which are still going on. How much political history, how much social history we should use, for instance, but is no longer narrowed down on the question: what did you say in the 1970s, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, there was one last question. I think it was you. Sorry. Yeah. It's true that in East Germany, in the GDR, that is, you had an immediate system of language that was to be used in order to refer to the Nazi past. And that was developed very early on and basically stayed as it was in the 1950s until the very end. When I did the oral history interviews with those born in 1949 in the early 90s, it was very interesting how the interviewees took up this offer. Because to be a victim of fascism, which was like an honorable title, they in a way used it to describe their parents' history in Nazi Germany and the war. They would say, well, in a way, my mother was a victim of fascism because my father had to fight in the fascist war. Yeah, so that was, and it's interesting, that's typical for oral history interviews, that, people, although they tell their own story, try to use public frameworks of dealing with the past to incorporate themselves or to write themselves into a more broader story. So I'm sorry.
No, it's wonderful. Okay, it's wonderful because then I can be very short now. That's why we did it this way around. I understood I start with Darius. I understood your question a little bit different in the sense that, yes, in West Germany in the 1980s, there was a kind of way of dealing with the past. There was this, what we have described so far in Weizsäcker and this grassroots movement and so on. And there was also some kind of a knowledge that things had been neglected for many decades. So yes, in 1990, 1991, there was this feeling of this time we'll do it right from the beginning. Our Vergangenheit, with the GDR, with this dictatorship, it will not be like in the first one, which started with equalizing those two dictatorships, which is doubtful from the beginning. But yes, I think it had to do with a moment in time when the wall fell. We don't know what would have happened 20 years earlier or 20 years later. And to Frank, very shortly, of course you are right, but what I wanted to make very clear is that it was important. It was also the Soviet Union who was part of drawing this line of what was right or wrong. And this is something we cannot discuss the way, they also are part of this, and I think it was very important. And also, as one of, I think you said it, in East Germany, or you said whatever, there is a knowledge about Leningrad, and there is a knowledge about how the Soviet prisoners of war suffered. So this is also the legacy of the GDR, which in that sense is positive. And the question, how do you it's a really difficult question, and Dorothee already mentioned the psychoanalytical part of it, but I would give a slightly different answer. I'm not so sure about the fascination with violence.
I saw that.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
If we take on this psychoanalytical framework, one could say that, maybe it's I think it has to do with a generation. Maybe it is this generation that is now fascinated with movies like Our Mothers, Our Fathers, are longing for a positive identification with their own history. While my generation, like I'm now in between, I was born in 1962, and not all of us, but we, jumped on Jewish history, being non-Jewish, which always caused surprises in Israel and other countries. Why do they do this? But it was, and then some people would say, why don't you deal with your own family history? Why do you have to occupy the victim's history instead of dealing with your own history? That was something that I heard very often. So maybe this new generation is like approaching their own family history in a different way, which, psychoanalytically could be positive because they work this through as well, and then maybe. So I don't know. I don't know whether there's really a danger or whether this is part of a longer process. It's open to see what will happen, how this generation will deal with it. But I think it has to do with the saturation feeling on the one hand, and with a longing for positive identification on the other. And I think it's interesting, just one small remark, not our mothers, our fathers, I think not, but there were many other movies in Germany about the bombing of Dresden, about Flight from the East, about these kind of historical movies on television. And the framing, we always wanted to write something about it. The framing was always a German woman torn between two men. One was the German husband or soldier or whatever, and the other was the British pilot who bombed Dresden, or the good-looking French prisoner of war. Not the Russian, of course, but the French prisoner of war. So it was, and I think it was very fascinating that apparently that was a way of telling a story, was to translate it into a love story of a woman being torn between two lovers, which woman
representing the good Germany.
Yeah. Which is really, we have to think about what it means, but we always wanted to write something about it because it's interesting that was the way you could talk about it, let's say.
Always played by Maria Furtwängler.
Always. That's always the same actress, yeah.
Okay, Gesine Schwan.
I would just like a little bit to add. I think we have to take into consideration that all these people here are not at all typical for a sociological average of a society. You all feel kind of existentially taken by these questions. I don't think that the majority of society is really dealing with all that much. So why could they live together? I quite well remember the 50s and coming out of a very political family. First of all, there was a large part of economic future, not only future, but concentration on the economies. And so this economy could absorb a lot. And it was a minority of Germans who had really been in the resistance, a small minority. Still in the 50s, the surveys said that Germans found that the worst time started in 45. It was not before 45, right? So this self-image is different. I also wanted to say, I think Adenauer as Ulbricht tried to acquire legitimacy for their half-state by the culpability of their people. The one is fascism, so it were not the people, but it was capitalistic economic system which was the author of all these crimes, and the people were victims. And there was an analogy in Western Germany. There were some atrocious people, maybe only one, Hitler, maybe 10, 15, something like that. And for the rest of the German population, they were victims. And to really elaborate about that, it lasted. It was, of course, easier in West Germany than in East Germany. First, because there was a free speech, and the generation around 68, there, after the trials, which showed how many their fathers had been involved, Einsatzgruppenkommando and Eichmann-Prozess and Auschwitz-Prozess and all these trials, then they realized how much their parents were involved. This was not clear before. And there was a controversy. There was not an analogous controversy in Eastern Germany. And also we have made these qualitative interviews, transgenerational interviews. The East German kids knew the situation where you could not speak out. The West German kids did not know that situation. So they, from the beginning, they were much more benevolent with their parents in the Third Reich than in the Western German part, because they knew how difficult and how dangerous it is. I'm not so sure with the thing with violence. I'm not so sure about that. It doesn't matter, but it's very interesting, because I think that was my third point. Well, I've worked a lot about the psychoanalytical methodology and transgenerational methodology, having written a book about politics and guilt. And there is a problem, first generation, second generation, third generation. And it is very obvious that the third generation can communicate much easier with the grandparents than the second, for many clear reasons. And on the other hand, we have found that violence which has not been spoken about reappears suddenly in a family, and nobody knows why. And therefore I think there is a new interest, even in the third generation, to ask what has happened in that family. Because this cruelty, I could even a little bit go on with the cruelty we now find in the social networks. This is such a cruelty we find. Of course, they are unlimited, they can say what they want without any consequences, but it's really disturbing how which fanatism and which sadism you find in these media. And I'm not so sure if these are not underlying transfer lines in the families.
Your question, then Tanya Pinto next.
I speak in Ukrainian. Please use the phones.
Thank you for your presentation. I am not a researcher, a scholar, or a historian. I am the head of the largest Jewish community in Ukraine. I am the head of the largest Jewish community in Ukraine. I have a question for Stefanie. 70 years of denazification, of thinking about the Holocaust, dealing with the Holocaust, Nuremberg, the catharsis of this whole complex of guilt. Is it not a bit over the top? Is it not too much? Now, why am I asking? Because I've been watching the research of modern anti-Semitism in Western Europe. I've been following it, and I see that Germany is also a champion in this regard. The highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in Western Europe is in Germany. Is that not the consequence of that over the top, of that too much denazification? Because this whole complex of guilt and denazification not only happened because of internal factors, moral factors, but also because of occupation in, whether by the Allies or by the Soviet occupation in the West and the East. I mean, there may have been an element of forcing, but I can't seem to see, one format. The things that were happening 70 years ago, and the things that we see now in the manifestations of anti-Semitism. That's the first question. The second question, I am not annoyed by reconciliation as a term, just that I don't see a better term, that's all. I understand it's not enough. I understand it's not sufficient. But there are two sides that presume reconciliation that were in a conflict for a long time. And if both of these sides have a complex of victimhood and both think that they are victims, how does that stand in the way of reconciliation? To what extent does it slow down reconciliation? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I will start with the last question about the term reconciliation. I'm not against this term in general, of course not. But I think for the German case, for the German Nazi past, I think it doesn't work for the reasons I try to give, and especially as far as the Holocaust is concerned, because it's not two communities in conflict, but it's one big community killing another. You know, it's asymmetrical. It's not a conflict, but it's genocide. And I think it's very difficult to apply the term. I mean, to apply the term reconciliation here. And it's not two collectives feeling themselves victims, but one who is clearly the perpetrator and one who is clearly the victim. And I think, and then a difference, for example, to Rwanda and other places of genocide is also that only a small part of the victims of the Holocaust were German Jews. As you all know, probably, I mean, I don't know, 80% or no, much more of the victims were Polish and Soviet and Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and so what, you know, Jews from in Eastern Europe, and of course French and Dutch and Belgian, etc., etc. So I just think that genocide in the context of the Second World War is a different thing and cannot be dealt with this reconciliation term. At least, I mean, on a personal, individual level, whoever is free to do whatever he wants to. So, but not on a collective level. And the other question about whether there's too much of Holocaust education and too much initiatives in the last 70 years in Germany, and whether this has to do with anti-Semitic incidents, I don't think so. I don't think there can be too much, but what I do think is that we need to be maybe more open, more relaxed as far as new forms of dealing with the past in new generations. There is now a very immoral impetus on young school kids. They have to go to a memorial site and to be sad and cry and suffer. And there's there was a very interesting work on this by a colleague of mine who interviewed school kids who went to, I think, Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen, and they know they have to feel something, and they refuse to feel it. Especially the boys. I mean, it cannot work. I said that yesterday, I think, in a conversation. Take teenage kids in a coercive way, like in schools, to a place like this, and it will not work out. It cannot, you know. And so the boys react to it like more aggressively, and the girls are frustrated because they don't feel grief and things. So I think there are problems in our educational programs, and I think these have to be solved. I don't know the answer, but I think it cannot never be too much, but I think maybe we have to be more relaxed on that and less moral. That's maybe the basic thing. But the anti-Semitic incidents, I don't think they have to do with this Holocaust education. I think there are two different things, and Germany is not scoring the highest in West Germany. Far from it. It's in Western Europe. What did I say? Western Europe. The number we are actually, Germany is in the middle ground. France and Belgium and Holland, and France and Belgium, most of us. As far as incidents are concerned. Okay, we have to compare statistics, but I don't think it has to do with this. I think it has to do with maybe in a sense that youngsters who want to provoke know that this is where society gets nervous. So it's, you know, if I use anti-Semitic language or images, I know it's very provocative and I get an answer immediately. And of course they know that this is like the sensitive point of a society, which might explain why they use a swastika in order to, whatever, in order to show some kind of anti-establishment protest. But I think you cannot link Holocaust education or make it responsible for anti-Semitic incidents. I really don't think it works like this. But on the other hand, it doesn't work the other way around. What is often done in Germany when there is an anti-Semitic incident in a school, then there's an order to take all the kids to the next memorial site in order to deal with it, which doesn't work either, of course. You know, it's not so easy. And I think personally, if you ask my personal, I think my personal take on that is that we should leave the memorial site for commemoration. You know, it's a memorial site, it's graves, and we should leave it to this and not use it for political education. We should do political education in political education classes and deal with human rights. And then we can talk about history, and we need knowledge about our history, but we should not instrumentalize, especially our history for purposes of modern Germany or day-to-day Germany.
I would like to refer to 2.5 points that you made, Gesine Schwan. First is, just that I can make that short because I'm totally in agreement with you. I think we as academics, from a more or less bourgeois background, often think that, the importance these questions have in our lives are, reflecting the whole society. This is not the case. It is not a working class issue, for instance, just to give one example. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that this is a very specific group, at least in Western societies. I don't know about in former Western society, I don't know about how that would reflect in a country like Ukraine. The second, as to generational conflict about the past in East Germany, I would come up with a different explanation, actually, and that has to do with my interviews with the birth cohort of 1949. It is obvious, I think, I'm the only historian to say that there is, in the GDR itself, there is basically no generational conflict, that is familial generational conflict about the Nazi past. There are very, very few incidents where youth in the 1960s confronts their parents, and interestingly, it's mostly communist functionaries who have to deal with rebellious kids who question them not about their Nazi past, but about their Stalinist past, for instance. While the general population, and I made most of the interviews among so-called ordinary East Germans, it never occurs to them to blame during the GDR times and right after, to blame their parents. And I think it has less to do with fear to speak out, because the interviews were done in the early 1990s, but it has more to do with a specific generational dynamic in the GDR, which is totally different from the West, especially with the first post-war generation that I belong to and that my interviewees belong to. And my understanding from the way these people talked about their parents is that they were totally convinced that their parents were victims of history, of a terrible history in the 20th century, and had continued to be victims after 1945, because they went on to live in a dictatorial system. And the way they talk about their parents, they were aware that their parents were very weak, very weak. Even if these were party functionaries, they talk about their parents with a sympathy in the German term of Mitleid. And they could see how they couldn't speak up, how they didn't have any economic successes. They couldn't speak up as political individuals, and so they remain in a status of having to protect their parents. And you don't accuse weak parents. The conflict with parents is only when the parents seem to be too strong. And that is not the case in the GDR, and that's, for me, that is the main reason why there is no political generational conflict. And so my last half point, just to defend this thing, what I said about the violence. There is this whole issue now in West Germany about the death of the witness. The witness meaning the person that you can interview, and the death of the witness refers to a very specific type of witness, and that is the witness of the violent first 20th century. I don't count as a witness because, I'm sorry? Witness, Zeitzeuge. There's no good English term for that. So I do think that, what happens is that all these witnesses are, conserviert, conserved, is that a term? Conservated, whatever. So you have them on tape. And you can look at them again and again and again and again, and the fascination. Just from my teaching experience, for instance, at the university, but also I was a school teacher in my first profession. There is an enormous fascination with this history, and it is ambiguous. There is a fascination with violence, and even in the GDR, there are reports from, as you know, in the GDR, young people with 14 went through this ritual of youth consecration, and so it was very often linked to the visit of one of those concentration camp sites. And there are reports in the archives about Buchenwald, how these kids in the mid-1960s react. And what they do is that very often the first thing they do, they leave the group and they go into the room of so-called torture and look at torture stuff. And I think, I mean, I don't want to overdo it, but I do think that that there are several levels to it, and apart from the fact that I think it was Lepsius at one point who said, our post-war experience is absolutely trivial given the first half of the 20th century, and basically, unfortunately, I think he's right. So that was the background, but I don't want to make too much of it. It was just, you know, a suggestion. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for two fascinating papers. I very much liked how you both deconstructed the myth of the success story of Germany's dealing with its past, and how you showed us that the circumstances were very specific, and for that reason Germany can hardly serve as a kind of model for other states. I felt myself confirmed looking at this newly developing field of transitional justice research, which tended, at least at the beginning, to work with such kinds of models, and looking at the Nuremberg trials at the starting point of this whole history. But still, on the other hand, there are other states in the world which seem to believe that they can learn something from Germany. For example, Japan, as far as I know, invited specialists of compensation programs to help them to develop their own program for the Korean comfort women. So I would like to ask you both, would you think that there still might be some experiences in these stories which can be helpful for other states who have to deal with a dictatorial past, as for example the states of the former Soviet Union? And the second very short remark concerning the Soviet prisoners of war. Sorry? Yeah. And the second very short remark concerning the Soviet prisoners of war. As you know, it took very long, until May last year, before the German Bundestag decided to give these very few people who are still alive kind of symbolic compensation, acknowledging their victimhood under National Socialism. What does this show us? If you if you mention rightly that in the GER there are many people who understood much earlier that the Soviet prisoners of war are one of, beneath the Jews, one of the largest victims groups of National Socialism, what does it mean that obviously their memories did not go into political action?
I also want to extend my gratitude for the two fantastic presentations. I have a short remark that consists of two parts. The first one is related to the German experience of coming to terms with the past. We heard from the previous participant that the German experience might not be useful to other states. I disagree, because that any experience is valuable and useful. The German experience can be useful within induction programs, and I've been to the Auschwitz museum, and young people go to that museum for one day up to 2 weeks. They look at the museum, they watch different films and videos, and I think that the critical mass of these young people try to identify with this pain and suffering. That's why I think that this experience can be of use and value to other states, but the open question is how we can translate it into the Ukrainian reality. And I also want to refer to memorial places. I live close to one memorial place, and on the 9th of May all the villagers get together there, the priest, children, and they read out the names of all the people that died there. And I must admit that the majority of the people remain indifferent. And I think that the emotional charge of such memorial events has been exhausted. I think that we need to start looking for more attractive and appealing forms. But at the same time, we cannot turn these places of mass pain into isolated, glazed spaces just for the sake of memory. Memory can perform its function if we refer to it, if it is appealing, if there is some sort of space for reflection and emotion. But if it becomes something distant, isolated, confined, if it becomes a very distant symbol or sign and it's not appealing, it does not make you sympathize or empathize, then it means that this memory does not work, that this place does not work. So I don't want to undermine the value of such monuments and memorials in Poland and Ukraine. There are many of them. We have a lot of Soviet-style memorial places. They are romanticized a little, but I think that we can still refer to them. They can still try to find some appeal there. And I think that in Germany, in France, in Ukraine, and in Russia, we are going through a very intensive process of oblivion and obliteration. We start forgetting what that war was. And I think that in this context, researchers and cinematographers and representatives of other professions should start placing more emphasis on one premise, which is the axiology and self-value of human life. Maybe we need to rediscover that war in a different civilizational dimension. Maybe we can start earlier, before the war, just to show how the human right to life was violated from the very beginning. And this way, we will not have to force our children to go to memorial places. We will not have to forcefully take them to museums and memorial places, but we will encourage them to reflect on such things. I worked in schools for a long time and in other educational institutions, and I had that experience of psychological provocation. I took my children to a hospital for children with joint defects. And even when I left my job at that school, those children continued visiting patients at that hospital because they got charged with sympathy, empathy, co-suffering sort of, maybe at least 90% of them. So once again, I do not want to diminish our capacity. I think it's important to keep talking about the horrific pages of our history. Maybe we can just start looking for more innovative and creative techniques for doing that, especially when we are working with the young generation. Maybe we can even use some elements of the game. This is something that we've been discussing with my neighbors, but what is really alarming that when you see swastika or when you see some dangerous games on the part of the young generation, it is an alert sign. So we need to neutralize that. Maybe we need to find new ways of working with the young generation to make them remember.
Okay, just thank you very much. I will try to answer both questions more or less in one. And what can we learn from Germany? And I think, well, the fundamental difference is, of course, as I said in my talk, that Germany was as lucky as to be defeated and had allies who forced this moral line of right or wrong. This is something we cannot repeat in other cases. But still, of course, I think what can be learned, or I mean, this is not even to learn from Germany, I think this is general. We need knowledge, and I think knowledge, historical knowledge, and this is, the task of schools to inform about historical facts and figures. And then I think what you said about these memorial places, which are kind of empty because people don't react to them anymore, I think it has to do with this coercive commemoration. Go there and then in a group of 20 and then, mourn, which doesn't work. But maybe let's leave them as they are, because they are important places of memory, and they are grave sites. And maybe in 20 years, when we come back here to live, we'll have a new generation who is appropriating these places again. Sometimes it takes longer that meaning suddenly comes up from a place where and a former generation didn't. Sorry, my voice. The former generation didn't relate to this place, and maybe in 20 years this will be different. So that would be one thing I think we can learn from the German example, that it takes many, many decades and more than one generation. And last but not least, what you said at the end, I think it is, and that maybe we don't even need the past for, it is simply to refer to human rights. And this is what's been done in German commemoration sites. They link the story to a general human rights question. And I remember my daughter just telling me she's 18 now, just last October, she's in a context of a discussion like this, why do you always talk about the past, how, isn't it more important to deal with the refugees now and deal with what is happening in Syria? There is war, there are people being killed. So, how do you, and I think that's a general feeling of the young people, and I think it's very legitimate that they turn to the present situation, and I think we should, I don't believe in force and coercive education, and I do believe in individual grief and mourning and memory, and I think we should maybe give them space, the younger generation, give them space to develop their own forms. Yes, that's it.
Very short. To Tanya, I can't answer this question. I think it's a scandal, and the only explanation I have is that probably after 1989, the whole ideological apparatus of GDR official anti-fascism was totally delegitimized. With them, the focus on Soviet prisoners. But that's not as an explanation. I'm just, I don't know. It's terrible. I would like to make a comment to you, because I thought it was very interesting what you said about the importance of these sites and the difficulties to work with them in a meaningful way that is really that really leads to new insights with young people. And I would like to take up the so the parallel for East Germany would be Stasi museums. Very often, Stasi museums are implemented in former Stasi, so secret police jails. And there is one very big one close to Berlin, Hohenschönhausen, where the director, Hubertus Knabe, totally, as far as I know, totally relies on overwhelming kids emotionally. He was quoted saying that when he sees a young girl breaking into tears at the sight of one of those cells, then he's happy. I'm sorry, but that was obviously a little. I'm not quoting him verbally, but according to the right. I think that's terrible, and it does not work. Yeah, but I would like to give you another example, just to describe the difficulty that you face in the case of East Germany. Many years ago, I was part of a discussion with a group of people who worked in museums like that in East Germany, among them the director of the Stasi Museum in Leipzig, which is a big museum, but a local museum. And she said that she was totally helpless in the following situation. There was a school class of, let's say, 12-year-olds or so. And that was in the 1990s. And so she shows all the exponents and everything, and then suddenly one of the kids raises his arms and he says, "You know what, my father worked here." And she didn't know what to do. And we were all shocked, and she wanted to ask about her helplessness in reacting in this situation. And I have thought about this boy very often, and I have to say, I thought he was extremely courageous. Yeah, it's very difficult, and that's what I mean. This is the situation that we face, and not you cannot rely on every child saying, this time it would be the grandfather probably. To say that is very difficult, but imagine the situation would have been such that you could engage in a in a conversation about this. That would have been wonderful. It's very difficult.